Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer, and I'm on another walk, and this time I'm in Findon in West Sussex, and I'm on a walk that I've done before. And the reason I'm doing this is, I think I did this about a year ago, I think so, in the first lockdown, I'm not quite sure. But the reason I'm doing it today is because I want to bring you up to speed with some more bits of information I've discovered or read about so far on the villages and the open fields. You may remember I did a video about that once before, but the first thing I need to do is, in order to get my walk done, is to cross the busy A24 and then walk up towards the church. Oh, sometimes it can be quite tricky crossing that road. So I'm walking up on the Monarch's Way, in actual fact, and if I can remember it, I'll try and put a link to the video that I did before. So I did a recent video, as I was explaining, where I was understanding that what I knew about how villages developed had changed, and so I wanted to just bring you up to speed a bit with more. So the old wisdom is, of course, that here in England we had the Neolithic people, we had the Bronze Age, we had the Iron Age, then the Romans came, then the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons ignored what the Romans did, had their own settlements, and the Romans, of course, had left, and villages sort of just grew from that, from pretty much the original settlements. Then I read that that was all wrong. So, where do we go from there? Well, it turns out that what we know about the villages as they are now is that they didn't evolve from those original Anglo-Saxon settlements, that somewhere between 800 AD and 1200 that there was a huge reorganization, a big reset, if you like, and that the villages that we now know that have stemmed from then came at that latter period, but the important thing is just before the Normans came in. So you see, I thought when I first read this, well, this great organisation must have been when the Normans came in, because they were another power. They came in, they did the Doomsday Book, they wanted to take stock of everything, they wanted to make sure that they knew how much everything was worth and that things were going to be a lot more productive. But reading Christopher Taylor's notes to Professor Hoskin's original book, The Making of the English Countryside, in which this revelation to me was given, says that it was before the Normans came that the reorganisation happened. So I was intrigued, so I've read further. So what we have to think about is the fact that the Romans came in and changed a lot of things. They built their roads and they had their villas, but they were very much scattered about, and they did not have the villages that we think of today. It wasn't the Romans. They had their villas and what have you, and when they left, the Anglo-Saxons came in and they had their settlements, but they were small settlements and small farm settlements, and they had their areas where the Lord would have a big barn or a big building, and then his workers and members of the group would all have their own individual places to live. Some of the Lord would have his workers with him in his big barn and that sort of thing, and then they would have surrounding them the fields, but not the big open fields that we think of, that which had the strips and all of that. That came later, and that's the crux of it. This is the big Findon Place, I think it's called. I can't remember now. Just behind me. This is a nice little spot in front of the Findon Church, St. John the Baptist Church. So here's a few things that we need to consider. First of all, when the Neolithic people were here, and at the end of that sort of period in the Iron Age, about 500 BC, there were far more people than we thought. I think originally Professor Hoskins thought there was about 1.5 million people in all who were living here, but it seems that there was approximately 3 to 6 million people over that period at the end of the Neolithic times and during the Roman occupation, that there was far more Romano-British than we originally thought, or at least Professor Hoskins thought. So there was a lot more people. Second thing to think about is the Neolithics were the ones that cleared the countryside. The Neolithic people over and in the Bronze Age and in carried on in the Iron Age continually cleared the landscape and left it pretty much as the Romans found it. The Romans didn't do much clearing. Professor Hoskins goes on to say that it was the Anglo-Saxons that when they came in, they had to start from scratch because everything had been left. But if there were more people at that time farming and little farmsteads, you couldn't let the countryside alone because it would turn back to wood. Anybody who's had a field, say, and left it for 5-10 years, you'll find that seedlings will have arrived and little saplings are growing and it will revert back to woodland. So once cleared, you wouldn't want to let it go. Now when the Romans left around 450 AD, or whenever it was, and these are approximate, I'm no expert, but I'm just imparting what I've discovered. There was this huge dearth in the population. It had gone down. Now whether that was all to do with the Romans going, I don't think it's 100% clear, or whether there was some sort of pestilence or plague or something, but there was definitely the thought that the population had dropped. And then the Anglo-Saxons started to fill that up, and very soon the population grew and kept growing. That's the important thing. And they lived, as I said, in their little farmsteads with their few fields, but squared off fields, not the big fields that you think of with the open fields. But there came a point at 900 where there was this great reset. So what happened? What happened? Well, it seems to me that in the history you had King Alfred the Great, and through all the different Saxon kings and all the different Saxon kingdoms, King Alfred brought the country into what we now consider England, the land of the Ingles. And I think that this is the point, and I'm waiting for Christopher Taylor's book to arrive so I can get this all confirmed, but I think that's when there was this need for some form of government across the whole of the land. And as the population was growing, they needed to eat. And the other things that we need to consider is their crops were not as good as ours. They weren't as productive. They were sort of primitive crops. They hadn't been cross-pollinated and whatever it is that we've done to our crops to make them so I don't know what the terminology is, but to grow more proficiently. So they weren't as knowledgeable as that. So they needed more land to grow sufficient quantity to feed the smaller number of them that there were. So that's an important thing to consider. And also, as the population was increasing, you couldn't let the land that they weren't using go to waste because it would turn back to forest. So I think that the Great Reset sort of works something like this. Lovely beech tree here, beautiful. So around 900 AD, the population was growing immensely, and they all needed more food. And so I'm calling it the Great Reset because that's the sort of terminology that we're all talking about, but the sort of second revolution that made the villages into what the villages are, and then the open field system, the 2 and 3 field system that came about, which Christopher Taylor now says was much later than we originally thought, or what Professor Hoskins thought. So it was clear as the population grew, these farmsteads were getting more and more bigger and scattered and disorganised because people were all over the place and they weren't managing to grow sufficient food. And it's better to be closer together, safety in numbers. So I think that's when there was this almost like this national idea that was going around and being shared on reorganising. The lords of these little domains and these manors decided they needed the transport links, so you had the roads, you would start to build scatter the houses. So the lord probably kept his house where it was, and everybody else was forced to move their houses in a bit more of an organised state. And some of these would have been in different places than the original settlement was. So they would organise these villages somewhat differently. But now they had this problem about feeding themselves, and I think this was solved. Instead of having these small areas around their houses and people working on them being very self-sufficient, they got a lot more organised and realised that they had these fields or this landscape, and of course they weren't terribly proficient on at that early stage on doing the set aside and letting the soil replenish itself. But they started to learn that. So they would have this 3-field rotation system, but that came a bit later on. So the first thing they had to do was to get themselves into a point where they said, look, there's a great big area of land, we'll call it a field, massive area of land. That was a field. They got everybody in the village to work on that field, to get rid of all the saplings and the stones and that, to actually to start to plough it up, because they only had so many oxen and so many ploughs, and it would take a long time. So they got everybody to be involved on that. Now, because that particular bit of soil, or the soil in that land, was varying probably on its quality, and everybody got involved, everybody needed to have a cut of that field. So rather than having one field that just one person gets the reaps of, or it all goes to the village, everybody needed to work on it. And everyone was becoming a little bit more self-sufficient and a little bit more individual in their little village areas. And so I think, and I'll confirm all this, but this is what, reading between the lines of what Christopher Taylor was saying in his notes to Professor Hoskins, is that therefore everybody had a little strip. And as more people grew and more people came along and the population increased, they kept having to go further afield. So you would have another strip. Everybody in the village would work on another swathe of land, which they called a big field. And then you would have, that would be divided up by all those people who worked on it. So that you all had the best, so you all had the same quality of soil on your little strip. So if one bit of land wasn't as good, everybody had a bit of the not as good, and where one bit was really good, everybody had a bit of the really good. So you started to get this 3-field system divided into strips, and that is, that whole thing is for another time. So you then had these villages and this 3-field system, and the landscape just kept basically increasing around these villages. And of course, as people started to trade with other villages, you had the roads being maintained. So I think that's principally what happened, and I think that's also why the Normans were very keen, because they could see actually that this later Anglo-Saxon period was of huge commercial benefit to them and would be rather desirable. And I think that's partly why the Normans then invaded, and of course they just added to that. They made it better. But it seems from Christopher Taylor's point is that this organisation, this government, this organising everything into this new system happened before the Normans. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Now, of course, I may have got a number of these things wrong, and I will confirm all this when I've got this other book and I've read more and learned. But I just wanted to share what I had recently discovered with you. You may not be interested, but I just wanted to share my learning really, and my thought processes and my understanding of it. And actually, it really does help. Sometimes you read stuff, it helps if you then try and explain it to somebody, because it reiterates what you've learnt into your own mind. And it seems that about that time, in the sort of 800, 900 period, that's when you started to see all the Saxon churches start to arrive and be built, because the villages were then becoming more organised and settled, and many of them have not changed from that time. Now, of course, there are some villages that have originated because they were out the way and in the middle of nowhere, that still originate from those very early Saxon settlements. And of course there are townships that have grown up from, of course, where the Romans had previously taken over the Iron Age settlements, whatever suited them. So of course it's not a very simple picture, it's quite a complex picture. But yeah, let's just finish off with some views of the church here in Findon, where I came to do a video with the lovely Julia one time, and the vicar came along and threw us off. I think they were having a church service, so I guess it was okay. But anyway, here we go. That's my little offering for today, and I hope you found it at least interesting, even if it's a bit fanciful, I don't know. But until next time, from a very cold Findon in West Sussex, actually seen some snowdrops here. Oh, marvellous. You know, I've seen so few snowdrops, and they're all around churchyards. That's where I should have been looking, of course. The bluebells and the daffodils are the next ones to be looking out for. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, take care, look after yourself, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.